Winter, 1944, somewhere in Berlin. The night outside is silent, broken only by the distant hum of engines and the muffled echo of anti-aircraft guns. Snow drifts across the city's ruins, settling on twisted steel and half-collapsed rooftops. Inside a dimly lit office of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, a group of officers sits huddled around a wooden table. Stacks of captured American documents lie before them, pages covered in neat columns of numbers, convoy schedules, and production graphs. Oil tonnage, aircraft output, vehicle shipments to Europe and the Pacific. The papers smell faintly of sea salt, taken from a sunken transport ship months earlier. A young logistics analyst traces a line on one of the charts with a trembling pencil. His voice is low, almost inaudible. Each month, they replace more than we lose in a year. No one responds. The room stays still, the clock ticking in the corner. One colonel leans back, staring at the flickering light overhead. He doesn't need to speak. Everyone in that room now understands what the numbers mean. That the war, despite all courage and sacrifice, can no longer be won. Fade to black. The narrator's calm voice enters. To understand how Germany's finest minds reached that quiet moment of realization, we must go back to the beginning of the war's industrial struggle. In 1939, when German armor rolled across Poland, few in Europe understood what they were truly witnessing. Blitzkrieg was not merely a military tactic, it was a logistical performance. Each armored division, each dive bomber sortie, was the result of meticulous planning and synchronized movement. The world saw speed and precision. What they didn't see was how fragile that balance truly was. In those first years, Germany's military machine appeared unstoppable. From Warsaw to Paris, the Wehrmacht's momentum felt mechanical, almost mathematical. The Reich's factories hummed with purpose. Krupp, Messerschmitt, and Daimler-Benz producing weapons at rates unseen in Europe since the Great War. German propaganda called it Totaler Krieg, total war, though in truth, it was not yet total. Civilian life continued in relative normalcy, and production was still fragmented across competing ministries and private firms. Yet, within this apparent success lay a structural weakness. Germany's economy, by design, was not built for a long war of attrition. It was optimized for speed, for campaigns expected to end before resource exhaustion. Its raw materials were limited, dependent on occupied territories and imports through unstable routes. By contrast, the British Empire and the United States had oceans of resources behind them. But in 1940, that imbalance was still hidden behind neutrality and distance. Inside Germany's economic offices, planners like Albert Speer and Fritz Todt boasted of efficiency. A single German worker, they argued, could produce more with less. The triumph of engineering discipline over mass production. And for a time, they were right. The Panzer III, the Bf-109, the U-boat, all embodied precision over volume, quality over quantity. As France fell in mere weeks, even the German General Staff believed the formula was proven. The Reich now controlled the industrial centers of Europe, the mines of Lorraine, the factories of Czechoslovakia, the oil of Romania. Hitler declared, "Europe is our arsenal." But this illusion concealed a fatal truth. While Germany reorganized conquered industries, the British blockade tightened. Oil was rationed, steel was stretched thin, and rubber became a luxury. Every advance consumed resources faster than they could be replaced. By late 1940, for every tank produced, another was lost in maintenance or transport. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, something quiet was awakening. America's industrial pulse, still recovering from the Great Depression, began to accelerate. Detroit's assembly lines, once filled with sedans and farm tractors, now started drawing blueprints for bombers and armored vehicles. Roosevelt's promise of the arsenal of democracy was more than rhetoric. It was a declaration of economic warfare. But in 1940, few Germans took it seriously. In Berlin, analysts dismissed American production claims as propaganda. Their industry is vast, one report read, but uncoordinated. They will drown in their own abundance. It was a comfortable assumption that complexity was weakness, and that Germany's disciplined design would triumph over chaos. What the analysts couldn't yet see was that American chaos was a kind of power. Each new factory, each shipyard expansion, each retooled automotive plant was a node in an industrial network that would soon eclipse anything Europe had ever known. Still, as 1941 dawned, the Reich's planners remained confident. With France subdued and Britain under siege, they turned their gaze east, toward the Soviet Union. The gamble was simple: win before the Americans could matter. The Blitzkrieg would have one more test, on the largest front in history, and behind that decision lay the quiet assumption that logistics once again would obey Germany's will. But logistics, like history, was about to prove uncontrollable. By late 1941, the war had consumed Europe. The German Reich stood at its zenith, from the Arctic Circle to North Africa. Its banners stretched across the continent. Yet far across the Atlantic, in the heart of the American Midwest, another kind of army was mobilizing, one without rifles, without tanks, but armed with machines, blueprints, and raw material. In December 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke directly to the American people. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself." Factories that once made household goods were stripped down and rebuilt for war. The automobile plants of Detroit began forging aircraft engines. Shipyards on the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico expanded at impossible speed. Assembly lines, once making refrigerators and tractors, now produced jeeps, artillery, and endless streams of ammunition. In less than 2 years, America would build more cargo ships than the entire world had in 1939. By 1943, a new Liberty ship would slide down the launch ramp every 3 days. Some took less than a week from keel to ocean. The scale was staggering. 2,710 Liberty ships, 6,000 merchant vessels, over 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and armored vehicles. What made this transformation possible was not merely money or manpower, it was organization. America learned to standardize war. From nuts and bolts to landing craft and radar sets, everything followed uniform blueprints. Components built in Illinois fit seamlessly with those assembled in California. The logistical miracle wasn't invention, it was consistency. Behind this, a quiet revolution in shipping unfolded. The U.S. Navy and Maritime Commission built an oceanic lifeline, convoys that would carry weapons, food, fuel, and vehicles across submarine-infested waters. The Battle of the Atlantic, often seen as a clash of ships and submarines, was in truth a war of tonnage. For every merchant vessel sunk, 2 more were built. By 1942, German U-boats still prowled the seas with deadly skill. But even at their height, they could not sink ships faster than America could replace them. Every statistical model German intelligence built began to falter. The arithmetic of attrition was turning against them. While German industry struggled under Allied bombing and resource scarcity, American production accelerated. The Chrysler tank arsenal alone produced more armored vehicles than the entire German war industry in some months. The Ford Willow Run plant built 1 B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. General Motors employed more people than the entire German army had logisticians. The numbers defied comprehension, and inside Berlin, disbelief persisted. In 1942, when captured intelligence suggested that the U.S. would soon outproduce all Axis powers combined, some officers laughed. They believed no nation could coordinate such volume without collapsing under inefficiency. But America's strength was precisely that, an industrial democracy that thrived on scale. Every worker, every farmer, every welder became a soldier of production. Women filled factory floors. Immigrants and minorities joined the assembly lines. It was war waged not in trenches, but in shifts and schedules. Lend-Lease brought this power across oceans. To Britain went tanks and food. To the Soviet Union, trucks, fuel, and locomotives. Even before America's own divisions reached Europe, its presence was felt in every theater. Painted in olive drab and marked Made in USA. By late 1943, the balance of global logistics had irreversibly changed. Germany's war economy, despite Speer's reforms, could no longer match the flow of Allied material. Every day, Allied convoys delivered more steel, more oil, more trucks. Every day, the Reich consumed faster than it could replenish. This was the true battlefield, invisible yet absolute. It was fought not with bullets, but with barrels of oil and miles of rail track. And as 1944 began, a new realization crept into the minds of Germany's intelligence officers. Somewhere behind the smoke and fire of the front, the war's outcome was already being decided. Not by generals, but by factories. It was this understanding, first whispered, then confirmed, that would bring us back to that dimly lit office in Berlin, where captured American supply charts would soon lay bare the scale of the impossible. War, for the German High Command, was not only fought in trenches or in the skies, it was measured on paper. In offices beneath Berlin, the Wehrwirtschaftsstab, the Armed Forces Economic Staff, collected reports on Allied shipping, aircraft output, and supply chains. They studied intercepted radio signals, captured manifests, and intelligence from occupied ports. Every number was converted into tonnage, and every ton was weighed against Germany's means to fight. By late 1942, these analysts already sensed something was wrong. Their calculations, cold, mathematical, unpolitical, began to show patterns that defied ideology. The Allies' combined industrial output was not just larger, it was exponential. For every ton of steel Germany could produce, the Allies forged 5. For every truck leaving a German factory, America delivered 10 overseas. Colonel Georg Thomas, one of the Reich's leading economic officers, warned early that the war could not be sustained unless the Soviet Union fell swiftly. His memos, often ignored by political superiors, described the war as a competition of capacities. Yet the Nazi leadership, consumed by ideology, dismissed such warnings as defeatism. In the analytical circles, numbers replaced illusions. Graphs began to look like battlefronts. Germany's curved downward. The Allies soared upward. The very people trained to measure victory had begun to measure its impossibility. Still, they kept calculating, as if logic alone might change reality. Angle 2. Technology of supply. The American advantage to understand why those calculations became so devastating, one must look not at the weapons themselves, but at the systems that delivered them. Germany's industry prided itself on craftsmanship. Tanks built like works of art, aircraft assembled with precision. But such design came at a cost. Every panzer required unique components. Every engine type demanded specific parts. Repairs became nightmares of specialization. Across the ocean, American engineers solved a different problem. Not how to make the best, but how to make the most. They built a war machine based on interchangeability. A damaged Sherman tank in Italy could be repaired with parts made in Pennsylvania. A Liberty ship's engine could be replaced with one from another coast. It was logistics, mechanized. The American genius lay in standardization and volume. Assembly lines replaced artisans. Welding replaced riveting. Efficiency replaced elegance. The result was not beauty, but endurance. In Berlin, German engineers examined captured U.S. equipment and were stunned. The quality was often lower, the finish rougher. Yet, the design philosophy was brilliant. They build for replacement one German report noted, not for eternity. It was an observation that struck like a prophecy. Germany's production model could not adapt fast enough. Factories bombed by Allied raids could not easily relocate or retool. Specialized labor was scarce, and centralized control slowed innovation. Meanwhile, American industry could shift output overnight, from cars to tanks, from refrigerators to aircraft wings. This was the technological foundation of logistical supremacy. Not superior weapons, but superior replacement. Angle 3, manpower and morale. The human engine of production behind every convoy, every aircraft, and every shell that crossed the Atlantic stood an unseen army. Millions of American workers who never wore uniforms. In 1943, while German civilians huddled in bomb shelters, American factories ran 24 hours a day under bright electric lights. Women filled the assembly lines, welding steel, riveting hulls, and stitching parachutes. Posters read, "Do the job he left behind." And they did. The transformation was cultural as much as industrial. American society had turned itself into an extension of the battlefield. Newspapers printed production targets beside war headlines. School children collected scrap metal. Farmers supplied the front with food, while factories turned out trucks faster than the roads could take them. The effect was staggering. Productivity climbed even as millions joined the armed forces. The United States achieved what no belligerent in history had: simultaneous full employment, economic growth, and limitless war output. To German observers, this seemed almost incomprehensible. In their reports, American industry appeared chaotic, too decentralized, too diverse. But beneath that chaos lay a rhythm powered by motivation, unity, and relentless optimism. One German officer, after the war, described it simply: "They fought their war in comfort, but with purpose. Their morale was in the factories." And so, while Germany exhausted itself trying to produce weapons faster than they could be destroyed, the Americans produced replacements faster than they could be used. It was a human victory, not of soldiers, but of labor. By late 1943, these three truths, analytical, technological, and human, were converging into a single realization across German intelligence circles. The war had shifted from the battlefield to the balance sheet, and soon the captured American supply charts would confirm it beyond argument. Every war, at its heart, is a war of movement. And movement requires fuel. For Germany, that single truth became a slow death sentence. By 1942, the Reich's entire war economy was already strangled by oil shortages. The synthetic fuel program, an impressive technological achievement, could never match the scale demanded by mechanized warfare. Factories in Leuna, Berlin, and Perlitz labored day and night, extracting fuel from coal through chemical conversion. But the output was a fraction of what was needed to sustain the Luftwaffe, the panzer divisions, and the U-boats. The capture of the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești offered temporary relief, but by 1943, Allied bombing raids began devastating them. Each loss of a refinery meant grounded planes and silent engines. Fuel was rationed down to liters per mission. Entire air squadrons sat idle, waiting not for targets, but for fuel. In contrast, the United States and its allies swam in petroleum. Convoys from Texas, Venezuela, and the Persian Gulf supplied not just the front lines but entire continents. American trucks delivered gasoline to Soviet tanks on the Eastern Front, while Allied bombers flew missions knowing their next refuel was guaranteed. The scale difference was beyond comparison. A single American convoy could deliver more oil than Germany produced in a month. The Reich's strategists could no longer plan based on victory, only on survival. Fuel was not just a resource, it was time, and Germany was running out of both. Angle 5. Intelligence and Realization. The moment of clarity, the first captured American logistical documents reached German hands in 1944. They came from downed aircraft, seized convoys, and Allied depots briefly overrun during the Ardennes campaign. Among them were printed supply tables, charts detailing weekly shipments of vehicles, rations, and ammunition, meticulously logged, coded, and categorized. At first, German intelligence officers studied them with routine curiosity, but as the data was cross-checked against existing estimates, disbelief turned to alarm. One report summarized it bluntly. Enemy replacement capacity exceeds our total front requirement. In other words, for every German tank destroyed, the Allies replaced 3. For every artillery shell fired, the Americans shipped 4. Even. The attrition of ships and aircraft, the nightmare of modern war, had become meaningless to a nation that could rebuild faster than destruction occurred. Inside Berlin's intelligence offices, statistical analysts recalculated their war models. Every outcome ended the same way: depletion. It didn't matter if the Wehrmacht won 10 battles in a row. The mathematics of supply guaranteed defeat. Some officers refused to believe it. Others, like General Alfred Jodl, privately admitted that the war's outcome was already sealed. But ideology still ruled the state, and truth could not rise above politics. The captured charts were filed. Away, marked "Nur für den Dienstgebrauch," for official use only. In those silent halls, the realization spread like a whisper. Germany's defeat was no longer a matter of combat. It was a matter of arithmetic. Angle 6. The psychological collapse. When numbers replace faith for a regime built on willpower and belief, numbers were its greatest enemy. In 1944, the German leadership still spoke in speeches of miracles. The Wunderwaffen, the secret weapons that would turn the tide. But among the analysts, the engineers, and the economists, hope had quietly died. They had seen the ledgers. Ammunition shortages became routine. Tank factories lacked steel. Railway systems collapsed under Allied bombing. The Reich could no longer transport the little it had left. The front consumed everything faster than it could be replaced. And yet, within Hitler's headquarters, the myth of control persisted. Reports that contradicted optimism were suppressed or rewritten. Albert Speer later recalled that he avoided presenting raw production data directly to Hitler, because the truth was intolerable. The psychological collapse began not in the trenches, but in offices, in the quiet realization that work no longer mattered, that every calculation, every adjustment, every clever design existed only to delay the inevitable. By late 1944, some officers stopped believing in victory altogether. Their minds turned inward, detached from ideology, studying the war as historians before it even ended. One of them would later write, "It was no longer a question of winning, only of understanding how we had lost." The German war machine had not been crushed by surprise or betrayal. It had been outproduced, outsupplied, and outlasted. And as the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine, that truth was about to confront the last defenders of a dying empire. The captured charts were not just intelligence, they were the mirror in which Germany saw its own limits. And soon, those limits would become visible not on paper, but on the battlefield itself. It was January 1945. The snow was deep across the Ardennes, and the German army, desperate, frostbitten, running on fumes, was retreating again. The grand offensive, the Ardennes counterattack that had promised to split the Allied front, had failed. Fuel trucks were abandoned on the roads, tanks left half buried in the drifts where they'd simply run dry. But amid the wreckage of that failed gamble, German units stumbled upon something strange. In overrun Allied supply depots, among stacks of ration boxes and fuel drums, they found documents, logistical charts, convoy schedules, and tonnage reports left behind in the chaos. They were printed on coarse Allied paper, coded but clear enough for trained eyes to read. When the material reached Berlin days later, it was treated with routine procedure, catalogued, analyzed, translated. But soon, the data began to reveal patterns that stunned even seasoned intelligence officers. The charts detailed supply movements from New York, Liverpool, and Cherbourg, a constant stream of men and material flowing like a mechanical heartbeat across the Atlantic. There were tables of replacement vehicles shipped per month, ammunition, consumption per division, and daily fuel tonnage delivered to Patton's Third Army. The numbers were impossible. One analyst, cross-checking the data against German estimates, found that the U.S. Army in Europe received more trucks every 30 days than the entire Wehrmacht could produce in a year. Another report showed that American fuel reserves on the Western Front alone, stored in vast depots under camouflage nets, exceeded Germany's entire national stockpile. At first, they suspected exaggeration. But as the data was compared with reconnaissance reports and prisoner interrogations, the figures held true. Every captured Allied convoy matched the rhythm of those charts. The realization crept through the corridors of German high command like a slow contagion. For years, they had believed that victory could still come through tactical brilliance, a counterstroke, a miracle weapon, a collapse of Allied morale. But the documents spoke a different language. They showed a war not of courage, but of capacity. In one internal memorandum from early 1945, a senior intelligence officer wrote, "Our enemy's production is not measurable by European standards. They manufacture destruction faster than we can resist it." The line was never published. It circulated privately among officers who already understood. Meanwhile, on the ground, the truth became visible. German soldiers scavenged for fuel, stripping wrecked vehicles for parts. Panzer divisions moved by horse and bicycle. Frontline commanders radioed back pleas for ammunition that never came. And still, the Allied columns advanced. Endless, mechanical, self-replenishing. Every road west of the Rhine became a river of supply trucks marked with white stars. The sound of their engines was constant, steady, and indifferent. The sound of logistics doing what strategy could not. Even the Luftwaffe's remaining pilots noticed it. From the air, American depots seemed to stretch for miles. Lines of tanks, crates, and fuel drums stacked in perfect geometry. "An army that cannot run out," one pilot wrote in his log. "That is their advantage." In Berlin, the analysts began to understand what the frontline soldiers already knew. The war's tempo had shifted beyond Germany's reach. For every destroyed Allied division, another was waiting across the Channel. For every bomber shot down, 10 more took its place. The charts confirmed it all. Not propaganda, not exaggeration, but arithmetic proof of the impossible. It was no longer a contest of arms. It was a collision between a finite empire and an infinite engine, and in that collision, the idea of victory, the very purpose for which millions had fought, began to dissolve. Yet, even as the data spread among Germany's analysts, the leadership at the top refused to acknowledge its meaning. Denial became policy, and the people who understood the truth found themselves trapped between mathematics and madness. Inside the Reich Chancellery in early 1945, the war no longer felt like a campaign. It felt like an unraveling. Bombers droned overhead by day and by night. The streets of Berlin were dust and echoes. In the basements of ministries and command offices, light bulbs flickered over maps that no longer matched the front, and on one of those tables lay the captured American charts. They had been reduced to summaries now, printed analyses stamped. Geheime Reichssache, top secret Reich matter. The data had been verified, double-checked, and quietly distributed to select departments of the General Staff. The Armaments Ministry and the Economic Office, Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, read the reports with grim focus. He had already suspected much of it. His own statistics told the same story. The Allies had achieved total material superiority. He understood the war now as a mathematical curve, one that had already crossed its final point. In his post-war memoirs, Speer would recall a meeting in which he told colleagues that Germany was fighting a battle of time and quantity, not strategy. The figures were merciless, he wrote. They left no room for hope. But in Hitler's inner circle, hope remained state doctrine. The Führer dismissed such data as defeatist. He insisted that German technology, faith, and discipline would triumph over mere numbers. The word logistics was almost taboo, a language of accountants, not warriors. Yet, among the officers who had seen the charts, silence replaced debate. They no longer argued over victory or defeat. They spoke instead of endurance. How long Germany could hold before complete collapse. In the underground offices of the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, WWII, an intelligence officer named Major Hans Kerl compiled a final report comparing German production to Allied supply levels. He concluded that the Allies could sustain operations indefinitely, while the Reich's output had peaked in 1944 and was now declining rapidly under bombing. His summary was stark. For every 1,000 tons of material we deliver to the front, the enemy delivers 10,000. The report circulated briefly before being withdrawn from official files. Some copies were burned, others survived, buried in archives that would later testify to the Empire's internal understanding of its fate. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the human evidence of those numbers unfolded daily. Panzer divisions arrived at battle with a third of their tanks. Ammunition allotments were cut in half. Soldiers shared rifles between shifts. Horses replaced trucks in the Ardennes and along the Vistula. At the same time, the Allies advanced with a precision that seemed mechanical. Every landing operation, Normandy, southern France, the Rhine crossings, was backed by an ocean of supply. Trains followed the armies. Engineers rebuilt roads within hours. There were depots, hospitals, kitchens, mobile repair shops, a moving infrastructure of victory. In Berlin, the officers who read the captured charts could almost see it. A logistical organism expanding across Europe, immune to exhaustion, and slowly, a kind of professional respect, almost admiration, crept into some of their analyses. Their genius, one report stated, is not in the weapon, but in the replacement. By February 1945, the truth could no longer be hidden even in the Führer's headquarters. Speer presented revised production figures showing catastrophic decline. Hitler refused to read them. His generals avoided the topic. But among staff officers, the unspoken conclusion was universal. Germany's war economy had reached terminal failure. The analysts who once calculated victory now calculated depletion. They spoke in terms of fuel days, train capacity, steel tonnage, not of strategy or front lines. They were no longer planning a future, but recording a collapse. The last of the captured American charts remained pinned to a wall in a Berlin office until the final air raid destroyed the building. One surviving officer later recalled seeing it illuminated by candlelight. The blue ink faded, the paper stained with smoke. "We understood," he said quietly, "that the war was already over. We were only watching its shadow continue." And outside, the sound of artillery grew closer with every passing night. From that point forward, no report, no battle, no speech could disguise the truth the charts had revealed. Germany's defeat was no longer coming. It had already been calculated. By the spring of 1945, the numbers that German analysts once studied had become living reality. The equations of supply and production no longer existed on paper. They were written across a starving nation. Coal deliveries fell by half. Fuel reserves dropped to less than 5% of what they had been during the summer of 1944. Even the Luftwaffe's most advanced jet squadrons sat grounded, not from enemy fire, but from the absence of aviation fuel. Albert Speer's ministry tried to hide the full extent of the failure, but by March, even he admitted that production had entered free fall. Allied bombing had shattered transportation lines, and the once proud German rail system, the arteries of the Reich, lay broken. Coal could not reach the factories, steel could not reach the front, and the front could no longer hold. Across the German High Command, the captured U.S. supply charts had transformed from intelligence curiosities into grim prophecy. Officers who had once mocked American excess now measured their own starvation against it. At the front, the results were merciless. Tank crews rationed shells, firing only when absolutely certain of a hit. Infantry divisions were issued with orders to conserve ammunition by using captured weapons scavenged from the battlefield. The famous Tiger tanks, symbols of power and precision, often stood abandoned in forests for lack of fuel. The men who once believed in Wunderwaffe, miracle weapons, now understood the cruel arithmetic of reality. Even the Me-262 jet fighter, the world's fastest aircraft, could not alter the numbers. For every one Me-262 that took to the sky, the Allies could field 100 Mustangs, each fueled, armed, and supported by an endless logistical network stretching back to American factories. By now, those same analysts who had studied the American charts in 1943 and 1944 found themselves assigned to recovery projects, desperate attempts to calculate how long Germany could continue to resist. Their conclusions grew shorter with every report. 4 weeks of oil left, 3 weeks of ammunition, 10 days of food for the army. The war was no longer measured in territory or battles. It was measured in remaining tons, barrels, and calories. And beneath the statistics lay a growing moral exhaustion. Civilians, once shielded by propaganda, now faced the physical evidence of defeat. Cities that had glowed with nationalist banners were reduced to blackened skeletons. The German people began to understand what their own officers had already seen in those captured charts, that the industrial world they had challenged was too vast, too resourceful, too organized to be overcome by will alone. Within the Führer bunker, Hitler continued to issue impossible orders. He spoke of phantom divisions, of counter-offensives that could not exist. But the generals listening to him were no longer strategists. They were administrators of decline. General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant architect of Blitzkrieg, argued for a strategic withdrawal to conserve resources. Hitler refused. The last reserves of fuel were poured into offensives that never materialized. The Americans, British and Soviets advanced with mechanical regularity, supported by supply systems that had now reached full maturity. Allied depots stretched from Normandy to the Rhine, feeding 1 million men daily. Trains of fuel and ammunition moved without interruption, protected by air supremacy and supported by an industrial base that dwarfed the Axis by magnitudes. To the German officers who had once studied the U.S. logistical charts, it felt as if the maps themselves had come alive. Those endless supply lines that once seemed abstract were now rolling through the heart of Europe. In the final days of April 1945, Speer attempted to confront Hitler one last time, urging him to allow the surrender of industrial centers to prevent unnecessary suffering. Hitler refused, declaring that if the German people could not win, they should perish. It was, in a sense, the ultimate rejection of the logic the captured charts had revealed. But even as Berlin burned, the last analysts kept writing, recording production figures, calculating ratios, updating losses. Some continued until the final shell fell. Their last reports, found in ruined offices after the war, ended abruptly with the same words: no further data available. The war that began with the precision of blitzkrieg ended in a silence of paperwork, smoldering factories, and unfinished equations. The numbers had proven final. When Germany finally capitulated in May 1945, Allied intelligence teams entered a landscape of ruins, not only of cities, but of records, reports, and calculations. In bunkers beneath Berlin, in salt mines in Bavaria, and in offices across the Reich, they uncovered a vast paper trail, detailed, methodical, and astonishingly honest. Among these were the analytical reports based on captured American supply data, the same charts that had once circulated in secrecy among the Reich's brightest economic and military minds. The discovery stunned the Allies. The Germans, it turned out, had known. They had studied the U.S. system with precision, broken it down into categories of tonnage, manpower, industrial output, and replacement rates. They had compared it to their own production and concluded, with cold mathematical certainty, that the Reich could never win a long war. The irony was devastating. The same bureaucracy that had built the most disciplined war machine in Europe had also produced its death sentence, calculated in its own offices. British and American intelligence officers interviewed surviving members of the Wehrwirtschaftsamt, the German War Economy Office, and the planning staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. What they found was a picture of a system that had been fully aware of its impending failure. In one interrogation report, dated late 1945, a German economic officer summarized it plainly. By 1943, we understood that the war was lost. We could measure it. Every captured document confirmed the scale of the enemy's advantage. The problem was not courage. It was arithmetic. The Allies, particularly the Americans, were fascinated. They realized that their industrial strategy, often criticized during the war for its excess, had been recognized by the enemy as the decisive weapon. The U.S. Army's logistical model had become a subject of study not only in Allied academies, but also among defeated German officers who admitted, almost with admiration, that it had redefined warfare. Captured German memoranda revealed an extraordinary level of respect for the efficiency of the Allied machine. One report from late 1944 stated, "The United States has transformed its economy into a weapons system. It produces not to fight battles, but to make battle itself continuous." After the war, these findings contributed to a revolution in military thinking. The Americans expanded their transportation corps, quartermaster systems, and logistics planning schools. The British refined their post-war defense economics. Even the Soviets studied German analyses of U.S. industrial methods, incorporating lessons into their own Cold War production models. For Germany, the legacy was sobering. In the trials and interrogations that followed, former officers and economists often cited those same charts as evidence that many within the system had recognized the futility of continued resistance, but could not speak it aloud under the regime. Albert Speer, during his testimony at Nuremberg, described the moment he realized that the numbers could no longer be hidden. "I saw that the war had become a contest of production, and that the enemy possessed limitless potential. It was not a question of genius or valor, but of capacity." The Allies used this material to confirm what their own analysts had long suspected, that industrial strength, logistical coordination, and production sustainability, not battlefield brilliance, had determined the outcome of the Second World War. By 1946, thousands of captured German documents had been catalogued under the U.S. Foreign Economic Administration and Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee. Among them were the faded American charts, the same that had once circulated through Berlin's war offices. They were later archived at the U.S. National Archives and in the British Public Record Office, silent evidence of a war measured and lost not by emotion, but by the balance sheet of modernity. In time, historians would come to see those captured charts not merely as intelligence artifacts, but as symbols of the moment when even the most disciplined war machine in history realized it had challenged something larger than itself. A world built on industrial scale, scientific management, and organizational depth beyond any human army's endurance. The men who studied those numbers in 1943 and 1944 could not have known that they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of warfare, one defined not by courage in battle, but by the mastery of systems. For Germany, it was a revelation that came too late, and so, as the documents were sealed and the lights went out in the interrogation rooms, a new era began. One in which the true victors of the war were not only the soldiers, but the factories, the planners, and the engineers of logistics. In the end, the war that had begun with tanks and banners ended with pencils and paper. It was not the roar of artillery that decided it, but the quiet precision of numbers, rows of figures that spoke of coal, fuel, steel, and men. The German analysts who studied those captured U.S. supply charts had not simply discovered an enemy's strength, they had glimpsed the future of war. For centuries, victory had been measured in courage, in the boldness of generals, the fury of attack, the endurance of soldiers. But the Second World War revealed something colder, more absolute, that modern war is not a contest of heroes, but of systems. The Americans had mastered the unseen art of continuity, the science of keeping every soldier supplied, every machine fueled, every front connected to an unbroken chain stretching back to the factory floor. It was a kind of invisible strategy, one that no speech or ideology could overcome. And when the German analysts traced those lines of logistics, ship to port, port to depot, depot to battlefield, they understood that they were not merely studying supply, they were studying inevitability. History often remembers the war through the lens of its great battles. Stalingrad, Normandy, Kursk, Berlin. But beneath each of those turning points lay the same quiet truth. Logistics is the architecture of victory. The men who ran the numbers saw it first, and they saw it last. They realized that no amount of faith, fury, or genius could compensate for the power of sustained creation, the ability to replace what is lost faster than the enemy can destroy it. When the war finally ended, those charts lay buried among ruins, symbols not of defeat alone, but of understanding. The men who had read them had watched an empire confront mathematics and lose. Yet in that loss, the world learned what war had become. Not just a clash of armies, but of capacities, organizations, and endurance. And in the stillness that followed, the meaning was clear. It was not luck, nor chance, nor even strategy that had shaped the outcome. It was the simple, relentless truth that numbers, once written, do not lie.